So a word of introduction about Dr. Regis Martin. He is a full professor of theology at Franciscan University, where he's been teaching since 1988, having arrived from Rome with a degree in sacred theology from the Angelicum. He's written over a half dozen books, countless articles, and teaches a busload of courses, mostly in the area of systematics, including the Trinity, Christology, ecclesiology, sacraments, grace, and virtue. He has lately ventured into the English department, where he offers a course on lyric and dramatic voices. And he is most happily married and the proud father of 10 wonderful children. So I ask that you would welcome with me Dr. Regis Martin.
Thank you, Sister, very much. And thank you all for coming. I am honored and delighted to be here. And I hope that today's retreat will draw all of us closer to Christ, who has drawn so very close to us in his passion, in his death, but most especially in his descent into the silence of Holy Saturday. In fact, he has drawn so close to us that we can reach out and lay hold of him, slowly torturing him to death. Well, on that encouraging note, let me begin. And I begin with a very brief, tantalizingly brief passage from, of all people, Plato. Do not move too quickly, he warns, from the many to the one. Do not hurry along too hastily to get from the shadows to the substance, from the various and scattered fragments of the many to that unifying one, that still point of the turning world. Now, Plato lived about 5 centuries before the coming of Christ, whom, of course, he did not know. Neither his birth nor his death could he have foreseen. But he spoke more deeply than he knows, because it is perfectly true that if you move too quickly from the many to the one, you may miss something enormously important in between, what the poet Yeats has called a terrible beauty about to be born. And that's what I want to talk about this morning. In the event of Christ, the details of whose life and death and resurrection are faithfully set down in the Gospels, what matters most may be what in fact happens between his death on a Friday and his rising on a Sunday. For here, it seems to me, are the darkest, the most somber colors, which remind us of the time he spent in the tomb, his body left to decompose in the grave of Joseph of Arimathea. And there, or from there, his soul descended into the silence and the shame of Holy Saturday. There he communed with the dead and the damned. The mystery of Holy Saturday. It is an event which expresses, says Joseph Ratzinger, the unparalleled experience of our age, that God is simply absent, that the grave hides him, that he no longer awakens, he no longer speaks. It is the descent of God into muteness, into the silence of the absent. It is the death of God that we are looking at here. And we don't need Nietzsche to tell us, or any other cultured despiser of our religion, to tell us that this is so, that God is dead. The church herself has pronounced it to be so. She has given it solemn liturgical expression. She has even found the perfect symbol, the perfect representation of that fact, having emptied all the tabernacles of Christendom on that day. It represents a mute testimony to the fact that God is missing from the world, that he is neither here nor there, because, quite simply, he is dead. And so we must, as the poet Eliot reminds us, be still and still moving into another intensity for a further union, a deeper communion through the dark cold and the empty desolation of that precise event, the absence of the presence of God. And for many of us, it is like an arrow aimed at the heart, a wound that will not go away. For many of us, it has become the defining feature of our spiritual lives. The forlorn sense that we have that God has simply gone away, that he is dead. And the fear we have that he may not be coming back. It is the great theme of our time, the spirit of an age characterized by an absentee God, his seeming death. But it is also the strangest and most profound kinship possible between ourselves and God. The two of us, God and ourselves, are somehow enshrouded together amid the silence of one long, unending Holy Saturday. At the same time, however, it is deeply consoling. It is a source of profound, continuing comfort. Because we must not forget that silence, too, can be salvific. That God is not only the Word who speaks, he is also the one who, bereft of speech, has chosen freely to enter into a silence of complete solidarity with the souls of all those who cannot speak. And so, as Joseph Ratzinger reminds us, there is not only the comprehensible word that comes to us, there is also the silent, inaccessible, uncomprehended, and incomprehensible ground that escapes us. That indeed there is grace and truth embedded in that silence, in the midst of that concealment. And it's very much like the concealment of God in the Eucharist, hidden behind, beneath, disguised, camouflaged under the accidents of bread, water, and wine. It is only when we have experienced God as silence that we may hope to hear him as speech, who proceeds out of the silence. In fact, in a deeply mysterious way, that speech is nourished by, strengthened by the silence. And if you ask, well, where does the silence begin? It begins in the death rattle that follows upon the awful cry of abandonment. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Here Christ cries out, our Savior, who at the same time is our brother, crying out from a depth of longing we can scarcely imagine. He cries out not for himself, because it's not about him. He cries out for the Father, whom he now perceives, whom he feels right down to the bottom of his pierced and crucified being. He feels him as being absent, gone, sheer, everlasting void. And yet he continues to thirst for the Father, because the Father is his meat and drink. But for some reason, the Father has withdrawn himself, his presence. How are we to understand this cry of dereliction from the cross? I don't know, but I share with the mind and the heart of the church the sense that she has, which is really the deepest certitude of hope, that after this, our exile, we really do not need to ask what prayer in our hour of darkness will be like. Can it be anything else but the cry from the depths in company with the Lord who has descended into those depths, who has established the very nearness of God in the midst of his absence, the intimacy we have with God, even in the midst of what appears to be our abandonment. In other words, a God who not only has offered to share in the pain of our death, the rending of body and soul, but is willing even to share in our being dead, the condition of being dead, our remaining in death, at which moment he extends to us, he offers us an unheard of, unprecedented gesture of solidarity. Here is what I know. Here is what faith tells me we should all know. That if there be a night into whose darkness we are forced to go, a place where no reassuring voice can reach us, a door through which we must go alone, then it is not the world that Christ came to redeem. What the mystery of Holy Saturday tells us is that God himself, in the form of the crucified Son, strode through the gate and the grave of death. He descended down into that final loneliness to which sin has condemned us all. And there he stood in the midst of all that hellishness, a sadness without end, a privation without reprieve. There he stood in order to set us free from it, to release us from a bondage which we were never created to have to endure. At one stroke, therefore, hell is overcome, because there is life in the midst of death, because love dwells in it. God is greater than death. Death, we say, thou shalt die. The dark dungeon of death has been blown apart by the Lord of life. A God so intensely alive, as Hans Urs von Balthasar tells us, he can afford to be dead, who having vanquished the whole nether world we call hell, has made it possible for us that we need not go there, unless, of course, we choose to do so. And why would anyone want to do that? Why would anyone want to take himself down into hell? A place where the door, as C.S. Lewis tells us, is locked on the inside, because those who are there refuse to leave, telling God over and over and over again, I do not want to love. I do not want to be loved. I just want to be left alone. And God, having paid us the intolerable compliment of taking our liberty with an utmost seriousness, God will not prevent our going there. Although one cannot help but think, here is a source of almost unutterable anguish for God, a sadness that goes on forever, because he created us to be with him. I read from the text of an ancient homily on the Feast of Holy Saturday. And in that short homily, we read how God has gone down into Sheol, a place of absolute loneliness and loss, a condition without light or hope. What has happened? It asks. And straight away we are told that on this day the whole earth was enshrouded in deep silence and stillness, profound silence, because the King sleeps. God has died in the flesh, and he has gone down into hell to rouse the realm of the dead. That is a lovely image, I think, a liberating image. He has gone down into the cellar, the basement, the bottom of the universe to rouse the realm of the dead. Like a father going in to rouse the family he loves from forgetful sleep. A lovely image. But not every image is quite that lovely. There are other images far less comforting. For example, if you read Dostoevsky, his account from his novel The Idiot of the dead Christ, his body freshly removed from the cross, his face shorn of all beauty, you ask yourself, you feel, as did Horatio on seeing the ghost of Hamlet's father, you feel as if you had been harrowed with fear and wonder. And Dostoevsky describes that scene, inspired by the Holbein painting of the deposition, the dead God laid out on the marble. Dostoevsky recounts the moment. It is, he tells us, in every detail, the corpse of a man who has endured infinite agony. Nothing is rigid in it yet, so that there is still a look of suffering in the face of the dead man, as though he were still feeling it. Imagine that. He's dead, and it looks as if he is still feeling the pain, the torment of his passing. Dostoevsky continues, and as one looks at this corpse of a tortured man, a peculiar and curious question arises. If just such a corpse was seen by all his disciples, by the women who followed him and stood by the cross, how could they believe that he would rise again? If death is so awful and the law of nature so mighty, how can they be overcome when even he did not conquer them? And if the teacher could have seen himself on the eve of the crucifixion, would he have gone up to the cross and died as he did? It's a question that takes us by the throat, I think. And the answer, of course, is that he had seen himself in Gethsemane the night before. And from the sheer stupefying extremity of that horror, his sweat became, we are told, like so many drops of blood fallen upon the ground. What else is Gethsemane but a vision of Golgotha? The cry in the garden points beyond itself to the place of the skull, to the hill where it will be heard no more. And 3 times, no less, will the Son's prayer go out to the Father unanswered. 3 times will he ask, and as often as he asks, he will be refused. The only prayer in the New Testament that was not granted. There is the whole paradox of petitionary prayer laid out before us. Sometimes our prayers appear not to be answered. But it doesn't mean that because there is no remedy for our pain is without purpose, without meaning. And the answer may come, will come, in a form, in a way, on a day we least expect. Well, if Gethsemane points to Golgotha, to what does Golgotha point? To Easter? Yes, most certainly it does. But it will not do to arrive any sooner than Christ our Lord. One must never, as Plato warns, move too quickly from the many to the one. So where does Christ go if he doesn't go directly to Easter? He goes into the silence of all that falls between. In a word, he goes to hell. And here the shroud of Turin comes into view, the image looming before us, the image of a man, the human being Jesus, wrapped in a winding sheet round his body, a body that has clearly been crucified. The wounds are unmistakable. They testify to protracted torture and death. Here is the perfect icon of Holy Saturday. Every detail corresponds exactly to the accounts set down in the Gospels. And it speaks to us. The hands and the feet, the face of Christ, they speak, they signify, they tell a story. The wound in the side, most of all. And from that side, we know the church and her sacraments poured forth. It is not Pentecost that gives birth to the church. Pentecost represents the public manifestation of the church, the monstration of her ministry. But her life emerges from the pierced and stricken side of the dead God as he lay helpless upon the cross. The wounds of the cross speak, they signify. And how do they speak? In what way does the shroud of Turin communicate its message? With blood. It speaks with blood. And what that blood bespeaks more than anything else, as Pope Benedict will remind us on his visit to Turin to pray before the shroud, what that shroud bespeaks is life. The shroud is an icon, he declared, written in blood. The blood of a man who was scourged, crowned with thorns, crucified, whose right side was pierced. The image impressed upon the shroud is that of a dead man. But the blood speaks of his life, especially that huge stain near his rib, made by the blood and water that flowed copiously from a great wound inflicted by the tip of a Roman spear. That blood and that water speak of life, like a spring that murmurs in the silence, and we can hear it, we can listen to it in the silence of Holy Saturday. May the mystery of that event, through the grace of that holy icon that gave it such incomparable expression, may it be a source of life-giving water for all of us during these remaining days of Lent. Thank you.